I am Jody Russell Manning. I'm the Associate Director for the Rowan Center for the Study of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights. I'm also in the History Department and teach Holocaust and Genocide Studies. So let me start by thanking our co-sponsors for the Center's Book Club. And this is each semester, and as well for sponsorship for today's talk. That includes the History Department, the Center for Belonging and Student Engagement, and the Hollybush Institute for Global Peace and Security. And above all, our never-ending support from the Rick Edelman College of Communication, Humanities, and Social Sciences here at Rowan, and especially our Dean, Nawal Lamar. I am very honored to introduce our esteemed speaker this afternoon, Laurence Rees. He is the author of The Holocaust, A New History, a Sunday Times bestseller that was described by the Daily Telegraph as, quote, the finest single volume on the Holocaust ever written. And this is an exemplary account of how the greatest crime in modern history came about, and by the Mail on Sundays as groundbreaking. I must stop and say I'm only able to cover a small amount of this amazing and abundant work from Laurence Rees. He's a former head of the BBC TV history programs, and he has written 9 books focusing on the Nazis and the Second World War. Many of them including The Nazis, A Warning from History, Auschwitz, The Nazis and the Final Solution, World War II, Behind Closed Doors, and The Dark Charisma of Adolf Hitler. We're also documentary TV series, which he wrote and produced as well. He's educated at Oxford University, and for several years he was a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He holds honorary doctorates from University of Sheffield and the Open University. His many awards include a British Book Award, a BAFTA, a George Foster Peabody Award, a Broadcasting Press Guild Award, and a Broadcast Award, 2 International Documentary Awards, and 2 Emmys, if that wasn't enough. Very, very impressive. So thank you for being here today, Laurence. We turn to talk with him since his newest work, The Nazi Mind, is a culmination of his years of research in this area and has been our Center Spring Book Club book. We're honored and grateful for this chance to talk with you today. And to be sure, the discussion with the Rowan community has already been quite engaging. So without further ado, I would like to thank you again for being here and may ask for a quick, brief statement to start about what brought you to this book, and then we can turn it over to my colleagues, Stephen and Mikkel.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Professor Russell. And first of all, thank you very much indeed for inviting me. I'm very privileged to be talking to you and grateful for the chance. How did I get here? Well, after university, the thing I really wanted to do in the world was to make historical documentaries. It's what I'd wanted to do since I can remember seeing some tremendous historical documentaries on television as I was growing up. So that's what I wanted to do with my life. I was lucky to get into BBC television, first as a researcher, then as an assistant producer, then as a director and writer and producer and so on, and was able to start making these documentaries on a variety of historical topics. But then when I was about 30, I made a film on Joseph Goebbels as part of a series I was making about propaganda. And that's when I first started to meet former Nazis. And I was intrigued because they weren't how I imagined them to be. Many of them were intelligent, amusing, still committed in many ways, but they didn't conform to the kind of slavering face of evil that you imagine. And this intrigued me. And from then I managed to get a 6-part series on the Nazis commissioned. And I benefited from the fact that so many of these people had just retired and so were able to talk freely, but they were still very much compos mentis. Also from the fact that the Berlin Wall had just fallen and we were able to get into Eastern Europe, into archives and to interview people who hadn't had a chance to talk freely before. And really from then on, that's what I focused on, not just the Nazis, but the Second World War, Stalin, and so on. This book is because the one thing that I go right back 35 years ago to when I first started meeting former Nazis, although I question whether some of them were truly former, but anyway, officially former Nazis. And the question was, how is this possible? How is this mentality possible? And that's been something I've been thinking about for 35 years. And this book really is the culmination of my attempt to do that, whilst drawing on, for the first time, research I did with leading academic psychologists and neuroscientists. Although it remains, if you're reading it, you know, it remains very much a history book. But what I was anxious to try and do was to make it relevant, because I worry that many people, certainly in Britain, aren't studying history because they don't think it's of any relevance to their lives at all. I believe history is profoundly relevant, not in the obvious ways that people sometimes think, but it still is tremendously relevant. And I wanted to write a book demonstrating also that that was the case.
Thank you for that. I will now turn it over to Stephen Haig and Mikkel Dack.
Yeah, great. Well, I get to leap in and go first with some questions, Laurence, and I would just echo Jody's very warm welcome to you. We do have a pretty diverse audience with us today. We do have Dr. Dack's global fascism class. We have members of our book club who are online, but we have other members of the university community, students, staff, and faculty. So I thought maybe I would just throw out initially, a question about the book itself, and if you could just very briefly, many of those on the Zoom today have read it, have read parts of it, or working their way through it. Can you just sort of very briefly summarize kind of what you were trying to do and what the main ideas of this were? You've already touched on them a little bit, but then I hope we can kind of unpack some of those, over the course of the next hour or so. So brief.
Okay, I wanted to write a book that was different to anything I'd seen before, in that what it was trying to be was, at one level, you could read it as a history of the development of the Nazi movement from the First World War right the way through to the end of the Second World War. But what I wanted to do within that spine, within that structure, was to talk about the development of mentalities in Nazism. How was it possible that they felt and believed the things they did? And to look at how that developed over time and how a variety of people, completely committed Nazis, people who were on the penumbra of it, how people who opposed it reacted, how the elite dealt with them, how Hitler behaved once he came to power, how he interacted, how he managed a whole disparate series of issues and relationships that he had to develop and sustain, and then going into the war and how the Holocaust could come through this. And what was the mentality of the people at different levels who were perpetrating the Holocaust. So that was the idea. And then with each chapter, I focused on one element that I know was not the single element, because as historians, we all know that there is a myriad of causes behind anything that happens in the world, but that I thought was useful to take for today. So for example, the first chapter is called Spreading Conspiracy Theories, which really looks at one of the central things that I think is key to understanding Nazism, which is the First World War and the way the First World War develops and ends, and how they seek to create conspiracy theories around it in order to deal with the fact that they lost. And we all know it's much, much easier in life to blame other people for something that you've done that's gone wrong than ever to face responsibility yourself. And in this way, you see how the Nazis come through that with Versailles, with all the various other things that are going on, to particularly blame the Jews. But so that's one chapter. Another chapter later in the book, I look at, in the context of killing, the killing process. I think it's really interesting that a lot of people think that gas chambers were developed in order to kill people in large numbers. That was part of it, but actually the Nazis killed more people by shooting at Babi Yar in 1941 and later on at the Harvest Festival killings. They killed more people per day in shooting than they ever did in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. What they were crucially focused on was developing a way of killing that allowed distancing from the killers to prevent them having psychological damage. And I think that's terribly interesting as we move now into an era of automated warfare. Because as an evolutionary psychologist told me, essentially we've all got Stone Age brains. That's to say, we've developed so fast as human beings, but our brains are still very much mechanized for the life we had thousands of years ago on the savannah. And we find it much harder to kill someone face to face than we do by pressing a button and doing it. And that's a legacy of the past and a potentially very, very, very disturbing one.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good overview. And the book has generated so much fascinating, I think, discussion in our book group. And I think you said sort of, use the word culmination, that in some respects this is the culmination of a really long and distinguished career in writing books and producing television and kind of films. One of the things I'm curious about is, do you feel like your views, your understanding of the Nazi mind has changed significantly over the, I guess, 30 or so years that you've been looking at this? Was there something that in pulling this book together that in reflecting on all this work that you've done, that you thought, I really started out here and now I'm there, in terms of really trying to get at this idea of the Nazi mind?
Well, I guess the key thing that's personal to me about that was I wrote a book in, I think, 2007 called Their Darkest Hour, which I don't think was ever published in America, but it was published in a lot of other places. Most of my books have been published in America, but I don't think that one has. But that one was much my most personal book. And that was about 35 or so people I'd met in the course of my work, and my interaction and feelings and conclusions from meeting them and what they said to me, dealing with a whole load of mentality issues, not just for the Nazis, but right across the board, Japanese criminals and Russian secret policemen and so on, a whole variety of people that I'd been privileged to meet through my work. And and I posed the question in that book, what would you have done in their situation? What would you have done? What I came to realize over the years since then, the 20 or so nearly years since then, and I express in this book, is that's a question we can't ask. And it's a question it's a very tortured road to go down if you do ask it. And that's because it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding, which is that you exist as an entity that could be in any other time. But so we have to understand that the line I'm most attached to in the book, the Nazi Mind book, is a very seemingly banal line, but to me it's important, which is, we are all creatures of a particular time and a particular place. And therefore, you can't take yourself out of the particular time and particular place you're in and imagine. You can try and imagine how they behaved, but you can't know how you would behave. And the influence, and this is particularly being influenced very much by Professor Robert Sapolsky's work, who was a great help to me in this book, and who I think is one of the greatest living intellectuals. Brilliant, brilliant man. I mean, if you can't really do it for your history class, but his book Behave and his subsequent book Determined are works of genius in my view, and he's a genius, and what it leads you to is this sense that we are all so incredibly shaped by, not in a deterministic way. I don't decry genetic inheritance, all those sorts of things. Of course, it's a mix, just as it's a mix in history of why things happen. It's a mix in ourselves of why we are who we are. But nonetheless, the culture we're in plays an extremely important part. And in the introduction to the Nazi Mind book, I make that point by looking at one of the children who was snatched from Poland by the Nazis and then subsequently grew up to be a committed Nazi until discovering at the end of the war that he in fact was Polish, and he believed that Poles were completely inferior and terrible. So he was, again, incredibly conflicted And
Mm,
he wouldn't have believed that. You can't, he wouldn't have gone down that route had he not been snatched by the Nazis. So it's this sense of cultural influence that I think people underplay, and they underplay it because it's a central part of, certainly, I mean, most people's minds, it seems to me. It says a central part that they exist as themselves, independent almost of
mm.
the situation they're in and the cultures they're in and the world in which they swim. And I think that's one way in which, over the years, my views have changed quite substantially.
Yeah. Yeah, really interesting. I think it raises, to my mind, another kind of interesting point of the book that's been a focus for some of the discussion in our book club, which is this role of psychology. And I wonder if you could reflect, on that. Is this something that you felt was a new facet that you brought to the book that helped you to understand for yourself and explain the Nazi mind, the Nazi mentality, as you say? Because I think, speaking as an historian, we're always I think we're always kind of conscious of trying to do interdisciplinary work, but also be very cautious about drawing on other disciplines where we feel like, oh, maybe we don't understand that as well. And so I'm interested to kind of hear a little bit about how you approach that sort of study of psychology, as enriching your interpretation of the Nazi mind.
Well, I think that's one of the ways in which I'm fortunate that I'm not in a university, because I know
Mm,
from my academic colleagues that they feel very much that, and they're very concerned if they move outside of particular disciplines. Interestingly enough, the first person to try and do this was an unbelievably distinguished academic in this area, Professor Christopher Browning, who,
mm,
again, over the years, he was a great help to me with the very first series I made 30 years ago. And I remember talking to him about his book Ordinary Men, and he tried at the end to look at, for example, the Zimbardo experiment, prison experiment, in relation to understanding perpetrators. And I remember he was very heavily criticized by a lot of his colleagues for that. Um, uh, what's important about understanding how I approached it was that there's a confusion in some people's minds when they say, oh, you're interested in psychology or neuroscience, because they think, oh, well, that means you're going to psychoanalyze Hitler. Or you're going to say, how was Hitler brought up? Was he swaddled correctly? Was that the reason that he did the terrible things he did and so on? I have a real passionate dislike of that kind of thing.
mm,
I write in the introduction to the book a rather scathing critique of the mind of Adolf Hitler, which was written by a psychologist for the OSS, a psychiatrist for the OSS during the war, which comes up with all kind of Freudian views about Hitler, which many of which are nonsensical. What I'm interested in is the use of psychology, not in that way at all. I'm interested in it in trying to understand broad human tendencies. And in that respect, I think it's incredibly useful and has been incredibly useful for me. Understanding, for example, how you can look at, say, take a group of 100 killers who were shooting men, women, and children in 1941 in the killing fields of the East. And you will know that you understand that within that group, you're going to find a small number of people who refused to do it, a large number of people who went along with it because they believed it was the right thing to do, but psychologically had a variety of different issues with it. And then a small number of people, more probably than the people who didn't do it, who discovered an aspect of themselves that they loved it. Well, that seems to me to be incredibly important piece of information to know and interrogate, because how was it that these people discovered they loved it? There's one story I mentioned of a SS man who was actually a plumber in Germany, a very respected plumber, putting in people's central heating and so on. He goes east, he discovers he loves killing, loves it. And then he goes back home and he goes back to being a plumber, perfectly good, nice
mm,
plumber. What is that telling us about, was this a tendency in him that he didn't know about? Was it
mm.
created because of it? How did this happen? And that's something that I haven't seen discussed sufficiently at all But it's just one aspect of it. Another is, for example, I always remember an evolutionary historian saying, a psychologist saying, people don't want to think that their brains were formed, the essential mechanisms of the brain were formed thousands of years ago. But he said, if you don't want to think that, just ask yourself why you're frightened of snakes and not buses. Because where most of us live, you're much more likely to be killed by a bus than a snake. But you don't go out going, there's a bus. And because you've still got it within you, this instinctive reaction against vermin, against snakes and those forms of creatures. So that's just one example. So I use this sparingly in the book, as you know, but nonetheless, it's massively helped me to not just understand this history, but to understand more about what I've been interested in all my life, which is what is it to be a human being, and why are we who we are?
Yeah. Yeah, no, really interesting. And, I will say your mention of Chris Browning's Ordinary Men book, I know will resonate with many of my colleagues as well as students. It's a regular assignment on reading lists in our history department. So, that's really, profoundly important text as well. I have one other question, and then I'll turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Dack. So one of the other things that I find really intriguing in terms of the account that you're offering, and this speaks to the subtitle of the book, right? The book is "The Nazi Mind: 12 Warnings from History." I was particularly interested, and again, we've had some discussions about, you make a real distinction between warnings and lessons. And I think a lot of people who may be coming at the book are looking for lessons. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that distinction. And why you were really eager to draw a distinction between what the warning is, as you see it, and what the what others maybe have called lessons. It just seems a really interesting point.
Yes, for me, it's incredibly significant. And what's interesting in many of if you go on Goodreads or on Amazon and look at the reviews that people write, many people say, oh, I really valued this for the lessons it said. So it's almost like there's nothing I can do to stop people just calling them. They're not lessons at all. And that's because I don't think history has any lessons. I don't think history can have any lessons. It can't have any lessons because it's not a scientific experiment. If you want a lesson, what you have to do is to be able to repeat it. Rather like Newton's laws or Einstein's work or relative, you have to be able to say, or rather like psychology, nobody accepts the psychological results of an experiment unless they can do it and it repeats. I mean, that's the point. You discover something and look, this phenomenon, this tendency repeats. History is not like that at all. We know that it's not like that at all. And it's a big mistake to look for lessons from history. I quote in the introduction one example that you see in the press here a lot of the time, which is people saying, just remember, a big lesson from history is Churchill didn't appease Hitler, so we mustn't appease dictators. But if you know the history, and unfortunately very few people in my country go on, I mean, the majority of people don't study history after the age of 13 or 14, which is a scandal, I think, but nonetheless. So I live in a profoundly historically illiterate society, but most people don't know that Churchill hugely appeased Stalin. So kind of what's the lesson? Don't appease dictators in some situations, but appease them like crazy in other situations. That's not much of a lesson, is it? Whereas what a warning is if you go to your doctor and he says, I think there's a problem with you smoking 100 cigarettes a day, it's going to shorten your life. And you say, but my granddad smoked 100 cigarettes a day and he lived to be 95. And the doctor can say, well, okay, he's the one lucky one, but I'm warning you, it's a mistake. That's useful information, but it's not as prescriptive as a lesson. And that's the sense in which I think history can offer us warnings. For example, looking at distancing, looking at the issue of distancing in killing. That's an interesting area that is telling us something about how people find it easy or hard to kill. Another one would be the Nazis get 2.6% of the vote in 1928, right? Hitler's been around for years. And yet, the huge majority of Germans know about him and reject him. And that puts a lie to the notion of this unbelievable hypnotism he's supposed to have allegedly done, which is nonsensical. Of course he didn't. But 2.6% of people vote for them. And then 5 years later, he's Chancellor of Germany. Well, it doesn't seem to me to be outrageous to say a warning from that is just next time you look at a political party that's getting 2.6% of the vote, don't say inevitably in 5 years they're going to be running the country, but nonetheless say, actually, there is a precedent. There is a precedent for things changing and these people not being looked on as a joke anymore. So that's the kind of sense in which I mean it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I have to say, as again, speaking as an historian, I like the cautionary note about lessons that can be drawn from history, which I think you're exactly right, can be overdone, and warnings, sort of kind of more general sense of what we can take away from reading history. I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Mikkel Dack, who is in the classroom with his global fascism class. I know they've had some questions. I would just take just a moment as Dr. Dack is getting settled to remind folks that we will be kind of turning to questions and answers, and you're invited to pop questions into the chat if you have them, or we'll also have an opportunity to raise your virtual hand and pose some questions to our guest today. But with that, Mikkel, over to you if you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Can you hear me? Am I coming through clearly?
Yep, you're coming through loud and clear. Yeah, thank you.
Technology works for once. Okay, wow, look at this. Oh, wow.
And there you are, right? It's spotlight on you and
there you go.
Libby Campbell as well, right there.
Yeah, right. Well, thanks, Stephen, and thank you, Laurence, for taking the time to meet with all of us. In your 6 hours ahead, I imagine you're in England. So yeah, thank you very much. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to rein them in because I followed your career and your publications for many years, so I have a lot of questions, self-serving questions, but I won't ask those. But yeah, first of all, let me just introduce you to my class again. This is just our course, like Stephen said, is on fascism. So it's incredibly relevant. It's you can see some of their hands there, but so they have we haven't read your latest book, but a lot of the themes and topics that are covered in the Nazi mind are we have or we soon will cover in our class. But I have two brief questions before we open it up for the Q&A. The first concerns testimony. I think there's a lot of value in your research over so many years, but I think what's especially valuable and meaningful is this kind of this longevity, is this collection of testimonies that you've accumulated over the course of many different projects, and during that time, I'm sure that you've kind of discovered some trends in what former Nazis are saying to you and how they're saying it to you, and remembering their personal history and their commitment or non-commitment to the ideology and so on. So I'm curious, after interviewing so many of these former Nazis, and presumably they weren't all killers and war criminals, but there were also nominal Nazis who party members. I'm curious, what did you observe patterns in how they justified or explained their actions during the war or during the regime? And do you think also that their accounts were largely kind of candid? This many decades have passed, often that were they telling you? Do you feel that kind of like the truth? You know, were they whitewashing their personal history? Had they built up narratives? What was your impression of how they remembered and communicated their past, generally speaking?
Wow. Well, that's a yeah. I could write a book on that, so that's a problem. But I'll do my best. In terms of accuracy, of course, the series that I wrote and produced and directed many of them for the BBC, they were expensive to make, and they weren't expensive to make because making them, me and my colleagues were paid a lot of money. They were expensive to make because of the investigative research involved. I don't think this isn't something that you could do without special training, and it isn't something you could do without a public broadcaster giving you the money to check and to do things. So the amount of effort that went into getting one interview on screen, you might have been through 30, 40 people. You might have, and so what you've done is to do everything you can to try and ensure that they are who they are, that the experiences they show chime with other broad experiences, that they're not making stuff up about particular events, and so on. So you're looking at all of those things. In terms of what they believe and say, this is what's really interesting. I had expected, when I met the first member of the Waffen-SS in 1990 that I ever met and had lunch with, if that had gone a different way, I never would have pursued the rest of my career in this area. I would have carried on making history films, but I wouldn't have had the career I did. And that's because he, I believe, was completely candid with me, but candid with me in a terrifying way. Because he was, after the war, he'd gone on, he'd served 5 or 6 years in Stalin's gulags, and where most of his colleagues died around him. He got back, and then he'd become a senior executive over time with a German car company. And you don't do that if you're a slabbering idiot who can't hold down a top job. And then he just retired. And he was very charming and very intelligent until you got him onto the subject of the war. And then it was like an alternate reality. And he held views like the Third Reich was the golden age, and that he was talking to me because I was English, and they all respected the English, which they did, which you don't think about. But actually, broadly speaking, they admired the English, as they called the British, interestingly enough. And he said, but the terrible tragedy of our life is that Churchill wouldn't make peace when Hitler wanted. And that meant that if he had, Germany and Britain could have ruled the world. And instead of which, Stalin comes into Eastern Europe, and Britain's bankrupt and a puppet of America. And he said, all that could have been avoided if he hadn't been so stupid. I mean, come on, you've got to see it. He then talked about the Jews and said that, well, they were, quote, a problem that had to be dealt with one way or another. That was his view on the Jews, and so on and so forth. So you can't believe he's pretending this, because if he was going to pretend, he would be self-serving, wouldn't he? If he was going to pretend, he'd be going, oh, it's terrible, what happened, dreadful, dreadful. And this repeated across many of the Nazis we met, former Nazis we met and interviewed. They believed there'd almost been a terrible misunderstanding here. That's why the mentalities of it so fascinated me. And this was not something I'd seen very much coming through in the archival text I'd read, but and they believed that that what happened after the war with the Eastern Europe, with the splitting up of Germany and so on, justified them. And also on the Holocaust, they believed, many of them, that it was hypocrisy to criticize them for the Holocaust. As one very rare that they would say this on camera, although one or two did. And the view that they took, broadly speaking, was, how can you criticize us for killing people in the gas chambers of Auschwitz when the children that you incinerated in the firebombing of Hamburg suffered more? So and I emphasize that I believe that's a completely false analogy, and I've written at length about how I think it's a false analogy. But nonetheless, there's a sense in which a number of these people believed it. So what's incredible is we study this and we think, what a horrendous regime. But then suddenly you realize, actually, for many of the people in it, they just think there's been a terrible misunderstanding and it wasn't horrendous at all.
Wow, that is fascinating and also, equally disturbing. I was hoping your answer would be different, but but thank you for sharing that insight. For the interest of time, I think I'll hold off on my final question, and maybe I'll ask you after the Q&A, after everyone's logged off. But let's, Stephen, can we open it up to the regular Q&A? Or Jody, yeah.
Yeah. So I did have one quick question from a student asking about. The student's a little concerned that it may be too political, but in our times, they want to know what you think about this modern neo-fascist movement and sort of a revival of Nazi ideas in Europe and America. And the concern for this student is about, is there something that we can learn to prevent against a trend like this?
Well, two things to say about that. The first is, if you think about me saying again that history can't repeat itself exactly, what I really hate, and the student isn't doing this, but just to say, is when you read people saying, "Oh, he's a Nazi," or he's another Hitler. You can't be a Nazi and you can't be another Hitler, because Hitler was a product of the time and place he was in, and he's gone, thank God. And you can't be a Nazi because the National Socialist German Workers' Party doesn't exist anymore, thank God. So people should be careful about the terms they use. As I say, this student hasn't done that, but in the context of all this, banding about Nazis, as you see on the internet, is a particular bugbear of mine, because people shouldn't do it. Is there something we can do? Absolutely, there's something we can do. And the first thing to do is to recognize that everything around us is more fragile than we think. Our bodies are more fragile than we think. Our relationships are more fragile than we think. The institutions around us, the rule of law, the freedom of the press, everything that we take for granted is more fragile than we think. And actually, you are blessed unbelievably if you live in a democracy, because millions and millions and millions of people don't, and they don't have the freedom of expression that you do. So whenever you see it remotely targeted, you have to protest and do something about it, because it can be taken from you. And the level of complacency that people have, the complacency of many in the elite who would put Hitler in as chancellor. They said famously, von Papen, the deputy chancellor, said, don't worry, we've hired him." See how that worked out? The potential complacency about the institutions around us is enormous. And I speak as I'm not a remote expert on what's happening in America, but from what you read here in the press and everything, this is something that should resonate, I guess, with you guys. But these things can be taken away. And if you don't, it's like, I always remember, was it Mayor Koch in New York who said was intolerant of graffiti and broken windows. And there's all this psychological evidence that if you target the small stuff like that, it prevents it getting much worse. Which is why it's important to protest when there's any impact on the freedoms that you hold dear.
Thank you for that. I just want to remind everyone that you can put questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand and we'll start a queue. We do have about 20 minutes left, so please feel free to ask questions. I wonder if I want to throw it back to Mikkel, or I can ask one of the questions from the book club. Maybe I'll do that and then we'll see where this goes. So one of the things that came up that we were talking about during book club is you have 12 warnings. What is the significance of 12? Were there more that you found that you left out? Was this, how did that come about? And maybe why not 10 or, something of this nature? Is it, I guess, and my question is, is there something that you couldn't actually fit in there that we should also know about? So,
it's 12 because as I was looking at the skeleton structure of the history, and the length of the book, 12 worked. And the difficulty in constructing the book was doing this dual narrative. That's to say, not just telling the narrative of how Hitler came to power in between 1928 and 1933, but seeing what I could take from that as a warning. And with that, I've already touched on it. It was the connivance of the elite. He couldn't have got into power. The number of people around Hindenburg and those around him hadn't decided that he was their kind of patsy. He was their guy they could put in and manage. So that was the number that, going through the history, I could think of that fitted into the history, and that happened to be 12. Actually, in a sort of way, there's 13 because the postscript also contains aspects of this. But when I said to my publisher, actually there's 13, he said, well, 13 is a very ugly number, so let's just stick at 12, and you can have a postscript which contains another one, but we won't number it. So that shows you also the extent to which one is influenced by one is published. But so there's no magic to 12. The issue for me was thinking, how can I do this dual narrative? But I'm interested to know what Mikhail's question is that he couldn't ask me. So that's the one that I'm kind of.
Well, right on cue, he has raised his hand to ask it. So perfect.
Okay, yeah, great. Maybe I'll ask my question quickly, and then we have another student, if that's all right, who would like to ask one too. Thanks, Laurence. So, yeah, and then this question is admittedly self-serving because my research is focused on the immediate post-war period, denazification, ideological disarmament after the war. And I'm curious, like through your many interviews and the testimonies you've recorded, do you believe, and this is going back to Stephen's question about this, the psychological interpretation, is there can a psychological transformation occur, in a relatively short time? Like you talked a lot about these unforgiving, like kind of these former Nazis who were unapologetic about what they did, or that they were very open, especially after they retired and they had their pension to talk about their Nazi past. But do you think, all things considered in your work, that former Nazis could transform and become committed Democrats and non-fascists or even anti-fascists?
Absolutely, and in fact, I'm incredibly grateful to you for asking that, because there is a danger when I talk about these people I met who very much held on to their views. You think, oh, well, that's everybody. Absolutely not. I think how you have to look at it in any transformation of belief systems is it's kind of like you have the penumbra and you've got the core and so on. The people I'm talking about are in the core. And this is where it's really interesting to read Leon Festinger's work, who was a social psychologist who worked in America in the 1950s. And his books on this are just fantastic, about people who believe in UFOs and things. But it always shows that you get this core believers, and then around it you've got a number of people who are there because they kind of believe and it's useful to believe and so on. And you saw that in Nazi Germany in 1933. Once Hitler comes to power, so many people suddenly want to join the Nazi party that they're overwhelmed with people wanting to join, and they have to shut the membership. Well, did all those enormous numbers of people suddenly just wake up one morning and go, do you know, I'm completely committed now? No, because what human beings do, many of us, is, hey, we're just trying to get a living and do okay and not be persecuted, and hey, so okay, I have to say this, I'll say that. You have to, and it may be that they thought that it was a good, who knows? But human beings are unbelievably adaptable. That's why one of the reasons we're running the world and dinosaurs kind of aren't. I mean, We're amazingly subtle and sophisticated. And just give you one story that showed that. After the Berlin Wall went down, we managed to get an interview with a guy in East Germany who had been a member of the Hitler Youth there, and as the Red Army was coming through, and he was younger than you guys in this room. He was about 15, 16 years old, and he had the homemade kind of petrol bombs that he was throwing at the Red Army, and he was completely committed Hitler Youth Nazi, absolutely. And that's what the interview was about. Afterwards, I was talking to him, and I said, well, that's very interesting. Thank you for that. By the way, just as a matter of interest, what happened to you afterwards? And he said, well, you wouldn't believe this, but I'd always been told that the Red Army would be horrible to me. But actually, I was knocked unconscious, and they all looked after me. It was fantastic. And I suddenly realized Nazism was completely false ideology. The way forward had to be communism. So he said, I became an absolutely committed communist and rose to be communist mayor of the town. And I said, that's very interesting. And bear in mind, this guy, as far as I could see, had no real sense of humor or irony about this. And I said, well, that's very interesting. Now that communism has fallen a couple of years ago, what happened then? And he said, well, you're not going to believe this. But pretty much immediately communism fell. I suddenly saw the virtues of capitalism. It had to be the way forward. So I've set up a factory on the edge of town. It's making a fortune. So if you want to know about what it is to be a human being, meet this guy.
Wow. Thank you.
Kel, did you have a
Jody,
question from a student,
yeah.
or do you want me to go ahead and...
Do you mind if we quickly do a question in the class? Is that?
Perfect. Please go right ahead.
Yeah, yeah.
Hello, thank you very much for joining us again. Oh, there we go. You kind of mentioned you were talking to, former members of the SS. I was wondering kind of like the range of the people that you interviewed, were there like former government officials, normal like tradespeople, and was there a variation in the amount of like still like remaining Nazi fervor that they had correlating to where they were during the war?
Well, a very perceptive question, and the answer is not as much as you'd think. Not as much as you'd think, because you would kind of think, wouldn't you, that someone involved directly in killing is going to be more of a committed Nazi than somebody who was just working in the propaganda ministry. But it never really correlated like that. One of the people we interviewed who was actually personally shooting women and children in 1941 and had then served 20 years in Stalin's gulag afterwards, convicted of crimes, was a Lithuanian who had worked alongside the Nazis' killing squads. And he was just an ignorant kind of low. He couldn't. He said, "Well, it was great. We got he didn't say it was great, but that was the implication. We got lots of free drink, and we hated. The Jews. Had obviously, we felt that tortured people on behalf of Stalin, and we just this sort of standard, almost ignorant prejudice." And violence, and he was somebody who came from a farming background where he's used to opening up pigs and slaughtering and everything. So he's just, I hesitate to use the word primitive in the context of a human being, but I mean he's on that road. So there's no great ideological development there. Whereas someone like Wilfred von Oven, who was one of the first significant former Nazis that I met, doing the Goebbels film, he worked closely with Joseph Goebbels. He was Goebbels' personal attaché, and he was extremely intelligent and sophisticated. And yet, you really felt he was a believer. He was a major believer in all this. And in fact, partly because he hadn't had to go out there and shoot someone personally, it was easier for him to believe it in almost a kind of a ideologically academic way. I remember one of our researchers talked to him after this film and said whether we should interview him for the major series on the Nazis I made, Nazis Wanted from History. And they went through the order of the rough programs that we were doing to see what he could say about them. And we were saying, the origins of the war, the rise to power and everything. And he was going, oh, yes, fascinating, fascinating. And then he said, the researcher said, we're also doing a film about the Nazi occupation of Poland. And there was a pause on the end of the phone line, and he just went, must you? You know, because he felt, oh dear, you're getting involved in all that, you know. Another former member of the SS I met, who, after the interview, we're talking about the Holocaust, and I said, you know, what was your view on that? And he said, well, I've thought about that a lot. And he wasn't directly involved in the killing, but he said, I've thought about that a lot, and I'd be prepared to say things got out of hand towards the end. So you're dealing with that kind of mentality, You know, some of these people, very intelligent people, the people who sit around the Wannsee conference and are deciding on key aspects of the killing, many of them have got PhDs, you know, many in law. So this notion that education and high culture protects you in some way, don't believe it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I have another question about your perspective on how Germany and Germans have dealt with this difficult chapter in their history versus how other countries and people have dealt with their own troublesome history.
Well, I have to say the Germans have dealt with it in an exemplary fashion, I think. I really do. I think, you know, the comparison that's often made is with Japan. And I made a series about the Japanese mentality, a TV series, and wrote a book about the Japanese mentality during the war called Horror in the East. And in the course of that research, I discovered that there's, as you can imagine, there's a very, very different way of adapting to this. I think in large part because of the decision to allow Emperor Hirohito to stay on the throne at the end of the war. But that's just my own view. But I remember an academic, a history professor, a Japanese history professor, saying to me, isn't it strange that the two great war crimes of the 20th century both begin with the letter H, the Holocaust and Hiroshima? And I thought, well, you know, it's one of those things. If you set it as an essay question and you write the word discuss, you know, I mean, come on. The answer is that's not so dissimilar a line, is it, from the line that those Nazis I mentioned were talking about as regards firebombing versus the gas chambers. And whilst we can all say that there's moral issues around the dropping of the atomic bomb or area bombing and so on, I don't believe there's an equivalence with the kind of medical experiments the Japanese are committing in China, or the kinds of things that I learned that they were actually doing. It's inconceivable that you would find a serious person in any position, I think of certainly in the academic world, who would be prepared to go near anything like that in Germany. I think that that Germany, for a number of structural reasons and also political reasons, has actually dealt with this extremely well. In fact, you know, there's an argument that the legacy is that they're overeager not to become remotely involved in any foreign military escapade because of this. But so I think you absolutely can see between different countries different ways of coping with it. And also, if you look, so many people right across the Nazi empire were collaborating hugely. The French, for example, They sent their children on their own, and one of the great crimes, they sent children on their own in trains to Auschwitz, who were all murdered. And they did that before the Germans asked for them. But so you can't say this came from Germany, absolutely. But you can't say that the only guilty parties are Germans. This isn't about being you can't say, oh, it's the German mentality. Look at how many other countries and people were however tangentially involved in this. And of course, the easy thing to do at the end of the war is to just say, oh, no, it's all German.
Yes, I agree with you. Thank you. And post-war politics and memory, very difficult, right? So I'm going to flip it over to Stephen Hague for a final question and wrap up. Thank you, Stephen.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I mean, it's been a treat to talk with you over the last hour. And one of the things we chatted about a bit beforehand, but I wanted to circle back around to is obviously something that's been on everyone's mind in our book club, and I think on everyone's mind in America. I wonder what you would if you want to impart any final wisdom or advice to us about applying the warnings, of your book to our contemporary world, right? I'm sure that there are struggles in Britain and in Europe more generally, but particularly here in America, everyone is, I think, very conscious of what's going on. Do you care to venture into the waters of how these warnings might be applied to modern day America, or anything that you would like to leave our audience with today in terms of what we can take away for things that we do today, or the way we look at the world today from your really wonderful book?
It goes to the central thing I say at the very end of the book, which is something I've already mentioned, which is the problem is that none of us appreciate how fragile the precious things around us are.
Mm. Yes, and that appreciation, I think, is something that can be reinforced. I mean, as we've been reading your book, I would say that some of what I think provoked some of the most spirited discussion was, should we be taking something away from the book, like this is a terrifying prospect that could be happening, in America, or is there some hopefulness that America does have the kind of institutions that that you mentioned, and it's not Germany in 1930 or 1931 or 1932.
But that's the key, isn't it? Nothing repeats. You see, that's why it's not a lesson.
Exactly.
It's not going to be. Trump is not another Hitler. This is not. But it doesn't mean that it's things around you that you think are precious aren't tremendously fragile, and that if you don't do something about it as an individual, if you don't join political parties, if you don't vote, if you don't protest, if you just sit back passively, that history does teach us these things can be taken away very, very quickly. And we interviewed a distinguished socialist politician who was in Parliament, in the Reichstag in 1933 when Hitler came to power. Hitler was made chancellor. And he said, what my colleagues in my party thought was, he's an idiot. We've had a whole series of chancellors over a short period. He's not going to last long. And in a few months when he's gone, it will be our turn. Well, we know what happened.
What happened? Yeah. No, really, really interesting, recourse to the idea of warnings and that sense of fragility. But no, thank you very much, Jody. I'll turn it back over to you to close us out today. I think this has been really a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for asking me.
Thank you for this. I don't want to take up any more time. We've gone a little bit over, which is amazing. But thank you again, Laurence, for joining us and for this discussion, and for all of those who joined this talk. And such a rich and thought-provoking discussion, and I'm sure that we're going to continue this in our last meeting for book club. So once again, thank you, and to my colleagues Stephen Higg and Mikkel Dack and the class and everybody who has joined us. But sincerely, once again, we're very, very grateful, Laurence, for you being here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for asking me. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Have a wonderful day. And your storms, right? So be safe.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.